Welcome back to another, podcast that we are putting on. My name is Jason Wood, and along with Lee Maddox and Michael Maddox, we are partners in a nationwide brokerage company.
Okay, Jason. So if you have a buyer who's looking to buy a practice from a seller that has more than one practice, and the buyer is only going to buy one, and there's one P&L, what are your concerns with these types of transactions?
Many. First, I want to know where the other practices are. I want to know if they've commingled staff, if they've commingled patients, if they've commingled expenses. And the fact that you just told me there's one P&L tells me that it's an absolute cluster.
Excuse me, I meant one tax return. Yeah, one P&L.
Yeah, one tax return, one P&L, which means one entity for 5, 6, 7 different practices, and I'm buying one. That's a cluster. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't do the deal. It just means that a lot of due diligence comes into play. And sometimes there's a saving grace because what they will have done is they will have bifurcated the production and collection by location. That doesn't always happen, but it's just, it makes things hard, but you can go like an onion and go layer by layer. When I represent a buyer and we're trying to deal with these issues, it is things like if it's a patient of record at the practice that we are purchasing, that is a patient of record that we are acquiring, meaning they're off limits to the other practices. Where it becomes more dicey, though, is with shared staff, especially post-COVID, where hygienists, assistants, things like that are harder to come by. If they are rotating staff and they don't really have a full staff, if they have 5 practices, they don't have a full staff for 5 practices, that becomes much more difficult. I'm actually dealing with this now in Chicago, and the seller wants full value for their practice, but they want to be able to take the staff when they sell. And it's like, well, what am I buying if all the staff is leaving? So it can definitely become more difficult, but that doesn't mean that we're not acquiring. It just, there may be, and this is what people don't understand, is there's direct and indirect issues as it relates to purchase price. So there may be direct suppression issues associated with a purchase price when you have one tax return, one P&L, shared staff for a 5-location empire. But there may also be indirect. Indirect being there's less potential buyers that even want to look at that. And so the indirect impact is there may be less buyers, which causes there to be less of a demand, which causes there to be usually a longer lead time to sell, which causes there to be a suppression effect on purchase price. So that's, again, not always what happens, but that does seem to be a relatively stable playbook. And then it becomes a buyer who actually is interested. How do we get through all those onion layers to determine what does this practice really look like?
Yeah, so I gave you a loaded question because there's many facets to this that are problematic. And you brought up this issue about it being devalued at some point for different reasons. Number one, the banks may lend less because they don't trust the financials. So if we're advising a seller that has multi practices with a single tax return and a single P&L, we're going to advise them to get a accountant prepared P&L. They can't do it on QuickBooks. It has to be something that's reliable. And even an accountant prepared P&L, there's going to be a lot of I don't knows.
Are we certified or are we just accountant prepared, CPA prepared?
At least accountant prepared. Certified is more expensive, but generally better. But there are certain expenses that are easy to decouple. Right, we can decouple rent. We can maybe decouple insurance because it's general commercial liability for one address for another address. But there's many things that are hard to uncouple. Staff could be could be easy to decouple from the P&L, but if the staff is going back and forth, like you said, it's problematic. And if the insurance companies like workers' comp in that situation are going back and forth, if they're buying supplies in bulk, and then we're trying to figure out, do we try to break it down by percentage, but that may not be accurate.
Correct.
If they have a lab associated with it, how are the lab bills being paid? So all of these things can make it difficult to determine what each practice value is, and make it difficult to come up with an EBITDA or some kind of a seller's discretionary earnings calculation, because we really don't know what the true operating expenses are. So there could be a devaluation just because the lender will trust it enough to do the deal, but maybe they want to discount it 20 or 25% because they don't trust it truly. So you could have that issue. Another issue that you brought up is devaluation can be because it depends if it's a branded practice or not. So if you have 5 practices or 10 practices under one name, one fictitious name, and now you want to sell one of them off, what am I getting as a buyer? If I can't use Lee Dental's RS in my practice, then what goodwill am I buying? If I can't have your telephone number, if I can't have your name, if you want to take your staff, if I don't get a covenant not to compete against you, if you got a combined P&L, it's very difficult for me to buy the practice. I might as well just start on my own. I'm getting no goodwill. So that could be an issue too. So I think that we're seeing this, right? We're seeing some of the DSOs needing to spin off some of these practices. And so there's going to be a lot of this on the marketplace in the next 5 to 12 months, maybe. Certainly in California, with what's going on with Denical, we may see 100 practices from one company suddenly hit the market that are under one branded name. And then if you can't use that branded name with your business, and Medi-Cal's cut, and they have centralized phones, centralized billings,
right?
They have staff oversight, where they're quality control issue things, then really what the question is, what are you getting for that? And this happened, I think you're probably part of this 3 or 4 years ago when one of the bigger companies offloaded a bunch of practices. And I steered a lot of my clients away from that. The ones that didn't, that bought them, ended up closing. A lot of those ended up closing because, again, there wasn't any as I said, stickiness before. There's no, if you don't get to use the name, you don't use the telephone number, you can't use their website. Right. What did you really buy? But that's on a more complex level, 5, 10 offices, bigger practices. But if you just have 2 practices and you're just tired of going back and forth and you've been using one tax return, one P&L, maybe what you do 5 years before you're going to sell is add another corporation and separate them. And at least 3 years before, get 2 different corporations. And generally for liability purposes, I like my clients to own each practice with a separate liability. A separate corporation for liability purposes. So if they get sued at one place, it doesn't affect another. So if you just have 2 practices and they're 15 or 20 miles apart, and you're getting ready to sell your practice and you think it's going to be 3 years, 4 years, or 5 years, yeah, you're going to have to rip the Band-Aid, and to maximize the value of your practice, go ahead and set up a new corporation. And as long as there's not a Delta Premier issue, you can go ahead and apply for new payer mix. Get credentialed in that office for the different plans with the new company, and it might be a little bit of pain. But then later, once you have that separate tax return, separate P&L, I think it's much easier to sell your practice. That's not addressing the covenant not to compete issue that you were kind of leaning into a little bit earlier. This is just a financial issue because it's just so difficult to get a seller that has 2 offices to reliably take the numbers apart. The sellers don't know. Like, they don't know where to draw the line. And if they do it 60-40 because of production, that may not be accurate. You could have a practice that does all implants and one that doesn't do implants, but the one that doesn't do implants has a higher volume producing practice. So the operating expenses are higher, but that doesn't mean that the lab expenses at the other office should be 40%,
right? Because
the implant costs could make it higher. So you can't just draw these, fast and hard conclusions about where we should draw the line with expenses. Like I said, some can be separated very easily, like rent and things like that. So the message for you, if you have multiple practices and you think that you're getting tired, you can put it on the market, but be prepared. You're going to have to spend some money to get a CPA prepared P&L or a certified CPA P&L, and you're going to spend $2,000 to $5,000 to $10,000 trying to clean up the financials, so that when the broker takes it to market, he can present something that's meaningful to the buyer, CPA, buyer's lawyer, buyer's lender. Otherwise, you're going to have trouble getting the transaction completed. And or like I said, wait, start separating the practice out and wait 2 or 3 years and putting on the practice. But the other issue you talked about was the covenant and the staff. So why don't you pick up on what your concerns are there?
Well, great point. 2,000, 5,000, 10,000. You can't look at it as an expense though, because that 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 that you're paying the CPA, you're actually solving a problem that's going to be coming down the road to you. If you are proactive with it and you're on top of it, you may not have a negative purchase price adjustment because you hit the market correctly. You hit the market running. You've already bifurcated. You've shown here's my CPA compiled. Here's what I'm showing. This is accurate. This can be relied upon. You will then probably have more potential buyers. More potential buyers leads to more demand. More demand leads to higher purchase prices. So sometimes you can't view expenses, and unfortunately, a lot of dentists, doctors view advisors as an expense. It's actually an asset. It's an investment where you're probably going to make way more than what you spend on the protection of the reduction in the purchase price. So, but as it relates to multi-practice, obviously there's two things that you can do. You can sell the entire empire, right? Which is easier conceptually to do, harder because there's less potential buyers. Or you can sell them, by location or maybe 2 locations together, but that creates more complexity. More complexity in that oftentimes you are, or at least what I see when I'm representing buyers and even some of my sellers, is they are sharing some facet of the non-clinical. Sometimes they're also sharing providers, either associates or hygienists or something, and that can make things much more difficult to determine who goes where.
So now, what do you do on a legal basis if somebody insists on buying one of these practices and we have this potential problem? What are you trying to put into the contract to protect the buyer?
As it relates to patients, I'm saying any patient of record of this practice that we are putting an offer in stays at this practice, meaning covenant not to treat, covenant not to solicit. You can't touch these.
And how do we manage that solicitation issue if the patient's name's in the database on all 10 offices?
We provide first we get a business associate agreement. Therefore, on the exhibit, we list every single patient name that is a patient of record, and that is an excluded patient for the other 9 practices. Now, you bring up a great point. In reality, how do you handle that? Well, you handle it really if there's 25, 50, 75 patients that are suddenly gone from the practice, and lo and behold, the patient chart requests are coming from these other 9 practices. That's really the only time you're going to be able to actually find out about it. The 1 or 2, the 3, that's not what a covenant not to treat is meant to protect against. But we try to handle the commingling of patients that way. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. It does provide some protection, some walls. The other issue is the employees. When I represent a buyer, I take a pretty hard stance that if they are at this practice, we get them. We get something because we need to have an infrastructure. So if the practice is doing $1 million and you have 3 part-time hygienists that are filtering in, we need 1. If it's doing $2 million, we probably need 2, if not 3. And so really ascertaining the practice that we're acquiring and the rough estimate of the employees that we need, if they're shared employees, is a good way, but it can be contentious. And then it's like, well, this hygienist is actually better than this one. And so it can be hard. The more a seller can be on the front end of it, planning for all of these issues, knowing, hey, hygienist A and hygienist B are currently rotating through the practice that I want to sell. Shifting hygienist B into that practice on a permanent basis before you go to market, hugely beneficial. The more that you can separate, even if your tax returns are commingled, even if your P&Ls are commingled, if you can start to bifurcate and separate so that you have a stability at the practice that you're trying to sell through patients, through employees, through systems, through marketing, is going to increase the likelihood that A, you're going to sell, and B, you're going to sell at a better price.
I agree with all that, but how are you, again, coming back to the issue?
I'm drafting revisions into the document.
You're advising your buyers to pay retail, pay something less.
I'm coming at it from, here's some things to look at as from a seller's perspective. If I'm representing the buyer, then I'm asking all the questions. How long has it been on the market? How hot of a market is this? Would you be able to add procedures? Like, tell me why this practice, out of every other practice that you can look at, why this practice? And then I start looking at the possible negatives: commingled staff, commingled patients. And then we come at it from a negotiation standpoint. They're claiming it's $1 million. Yeah, it might be $1 million if all things being accurate. And that's, unfortunately, a lot of brokers don't go into the analysis of the positives and negatives associated with that practice. They just take an EBITDA calculation, or they take a multiple of earnings, or they take a percentage, and they say, oh, one size fits all. This practice is worth $850,000. Well, but it's not, because you haven't taken into account the negatives. It very well may be if you can find the right buyer, but the likelihood is that practice is going to sit, and that practice is going to wait, and then I'm going to come in at a price of substantially lower and let you talk me up a tiny bit.
Okay.
So, but from a seller standpoint, those are some ways to protect your purchase price.
Yeah, so a good planning ahead of time for the sellers is to separate the practice or get good financials done in place.
Well, I think speaking to a broker that understands all of these things is important.
Separating staff, separating supplies, separating lab, silo everything so it's very easy for people to separate it out, because then you're not having to guess later when you're putting the financials. And that would make it easier for the buyer to do their diligence and the buyer's team to understand what they're looking at, and the seller to do a loan. And the second thing that we need to talk about with this issue is debt as it relates to multi-practices.
Oh, the fun part.
So, what are your concerns with the multi-practices when your buyer is buying your practice as it relates to practice liens?
Well, most of the time, the vast majority of the time, the liens are basically what's called cross-collateralized. Cross-collateralized loans basically attach practice 1 to practice 2 to practice 3 to practice 4. And banks are loath to get rid of security. And so, again, from a seller's perspective, if you can properly plan and you've got the right advisors representing you, you can properly plan and deal with this on the front end. You're negotiating with the bank. You're setting up a structure. For instance, if my loans are with Bank of America, or if my loans are with U.S. Bank, two of the bigger lenders out there in the dental space, if I am the seller and I'm having active conversations with my bank, this is what I'm planning on doing. I'm planning on offloading practice number 1, refocusing my efforts on 2, 3, 4, and 5, and here are the reasons why. They are going to be more open to it, especially if your debt to income ratio is good. But secondly, as the seller, you can be dictating, hey, I need you to use this bank because they're not going to release the liens unless you do a loan with them. That's usually how it works. And from a buyer's perspective, if the bank is not willing to do that, then we're dead in the water, because we can't really move forward. So a seller being, again, proactive, working with advisors that understand this, and the amount of brokers that don't understand this, the amount of times that we have submitted an offer, had an offer accepted, only to find out that the broker has no idea what they're dealing with. They don't understand that the practices are cross-collateralized. I mean, I would say I've probably handled 25, 30 states where this has been an issue on one practice or another. And the fact that you're talking about this, obviously, you've dealt with it, you're proactive. The amount of brokers that know that are minuscule. And so,
yeah, and I think people don't understand that EIDL loans,
right,
over $150,000. Well, any EIDL loan has a lien on it, even if it's $150,000. And any EIDL loan, is it over $250,000, that it's got a personal guarantee. So you're right. If they sell the practice and they have an equipment loan or an EIDL loan, it's probably been cross-collateralized with the asset. So if you sell it, you're going to have to pay that off. And you may come out of that transaction having to put money into the deal because there's not enough money to pay the debt off. So again, I think sellers, if you have multi-specialty practices, I mean, first off, if you're setting up, make sure they're far enough apart so there's not going to be a covenant issue.
Right.
And then I would set up separate corporations or separate LLCs, depending on the state you're in, run independent financials for each of them. Now, that doesn't work well for a lot of people that want to build an empire with 15, 20 practices. So if you're clearly going to be scaling it, then you might be working under one corporation or one LLC. But if you're just going to have one or two offices, probably have a separate entity and run separate financials. So if you do get tired of going back and forth or having double staff, double overhead, double everything, you want to sell one of them, it's going to be an easier path for you because you have separate financials. And I would do the best I can to try to keep my team separate and not, like you said, have people going back and forth.
Right.
Because that certainly causes some confusion. So hopefully that's helpful for you, people that have multi-offices, one or two offices, on how to get ready to get your practice for sale. Feel free to call us. We'll talk that through. If you're somebody buying into a practice that's one or two offices, you have an understanding of some of the things to look for. If you're buying into an office that has 10 or 15 practices or more where it's branded, be aware that you should be buying it at a super discount because there's no goodwill attached to it if you don't get the name, the telephone number, the website, and they're taking the staff. So yeah, those are some things to look for if you're going to do multi-practice specialty buying or selling.
If you have any other questions, feel free to click the link below, and hopefully we can assist you in that process.